Thanks everyone for joining us for the earlier part of the evening, the AGM. I'm going to give a talk now for about 25 minutes or so, to half an hour, and an opportunity for you then to ask questions of me afterwards. So yes, as you've heard a bit from me already this evening, Vicky introduced me. I'm Nick Bruce White. I'm the new Chief Executive of Devon Wildlife Trust, and I started with the Trust back in September. I'm just going to say a few things about me and then hopefully give you a few inspirational tales about how Devon is a pioneer for nature conservation. I want to leave you feeling that we in Devon, us Devonians, are real pioneers, real groundbreakers when it comes to nature conservation. So that's my objective. And then, as I say, we'll have questions at the end. So please do continue to pose questions in the chat and we'll get round to as many of those as we can before 8 o'clock. So just a little bit about me, who I am, where I came from. So I grew up on our family farm in Wiltshire, just north of Salisbury, near Stonehenge. It's a farm now run by my younger brother, Charlie. Really proud of my farming background. It's been a really important part of my conservation career as well. And as I'll talk a bit more about later, I think that link between nature and farming is absolutely critical for us right now. I've lived in Exeter for 8 years with my wife, Katrina, and Elspeth. This is Katrina here. Katrina also works in the conservation sector. She currently works for National Trust and previously has worked with the Woodland Trust and the RSPB, and she's an Equality and Diversity and Inclusion Manager. Last thing to say, no one talked to me for long without me talking about the boring subject of running. I'm a really keen runner, really keen marathon runner. And the only thing I'll say is that if things come together as I hope they do over the next few weeks and months, you may be hearing a little bit more from me soon with a very special plan to raise funds for nature at next year's London Marathon. So watch this space. You'll be hearing from me on that shortly, I hope. So that's me and my career. As I mentioned earlier, I was really lucky to come out of a zoology degree at Leeds University, and within about a week, stumbled across this wonderful organisation called the RSPB. I'd moved to Staffordshire after university and stumbled across a fantastic nature reserve called Coombs Valley on the edge of the Peak District, where I began, as we saw from one of our volunteer awards earlier, Emily, who's one of our long-term volunteers at Devon Wildlife Trust. I began a year's long-term volunteering with the RSPB, and that kick-started what has been a fabulously varied and blessed career right the way across the country, doing a variety of operational roles. So some of those highlights in my career include establishing the RSPB's flagship Rainham Marshes Nature Reserve on the edge of the Thames in East London, turning a MOD firing range into one of the best lowland wet grasslands in the whole of the south of England. I manage the RSPB's nature reserve estate across northern England, fantastic places from the Peak District to the North Pennines to Morecambe Bay, Coca Island and Northumberland, so some fantastic sites up there. And then when I came down to the southwest 8 years ago, I took up the role of operations director for the RSPB across south of England, so managing a fantastically diverse portfolio from Essex across to the Isles of Scilly. So being involved with things like Wallasey Island here in the top left, Europe's biggest coastal realignment scheme, a fantastic scheme that happened courtesy of all of the earth that came from underground in the Crossrail project, what is now the Elizabeth Line in London, creating this fantastic hundreds and hundreds of hectares of new salt marsh and wetland habitat in Essex. Been very involved in the Somerset Levels. This is Ham Wall near Glastonbury. And did some amazing things such as restoring seabird islands on the Isles of Scilly, and I'll touch a bit more on that theme a bit later. But after spending 22 years with the RSPB, literally half of my lifetime this summer, I had a hankering for something else. I was drawn to somewhere else. And that somewhere else was the place I now call home, Devon, and the amazing organisation which I now have the privilege to lead, Devon Wildlife Trust. And I was drawn to Devon for, I guess, the very same reasons that you are drawn to living in Devon and supporting the Wildlife Trust yourself. And, you know, why is Devon so special? So, I mean, maps like this don't really do it justice, but just to repeat some things I'm sure you know very well yourself already. We're a county with 2 national parks, with 5 areas of outstanding natural beauty, a biosphere reserve, 205 sites of special scientific interest, 9 special areas of conservation, which are sites which are important on the European scale, 3 special protection areas, which are European level designated sites for birds, 12 marine conservation zones, and over 2,000 county wildlife sites. It's a county, as we know, that's full of iconic species, nature-rich estuaries, remote uplands, flower-rich grasslands, stunning temperate rainforests, and we have a world-class marine environment here in our 2 coasts in Devon. So, quite simply, I don't think you need me to tell you this. Very few places quite as special as Devon when it comes to our landscapes, our seascapes, and the natural environment. It really is a special place. But sadly, and don't worry, I'm not going to dwell on this, sadly, Devon is not immune from the problems that face nature across the UK and worldwide. So the State of Nature report was republished just a few weeks ago, and at the Great Britain scale, the State of Nature report reminded us that 1 in 6 species are at risk of extinction in GB, that overall wildlife has declined by nearly 20% since 1970, that over half of our flowering plants have decreased in their distribution, and that seabirds have declined by 24% since 1986. Some really shocking statistics at the UK scale. Indeed, since the Devon Biodiversity Action Plan was produced in 1998, 7 UK priority species have become extinct in England, 7 species, and 2 of those species that have gone extinct were found here in Devon. So we've lost species, and sadly we are on the brink still of losing several more iconic species here in Devon. Iconic species like the water vole, like breeding curlew, like white-clawed crayfish, freshwater pearl mussel, ring ouzel, high brown fritillary, field gentian. The list sadly goes on. None of our rivers are in good ecological condition. We spoke earlier about some of the challenges facing our rivers. Of those 205 sites of special scientific interest I mentioned earlier, 67% of them, over 2/3, are in unfavourable condition. And that situation is even worse in our national parks, the places that we think should be our gems for wildlife. I could go on, and I could share hundreds of graphs and hundreds of pictures which demonstrate these declines. Sadly, there aren't many out there, but I won't do. I will, however, just draw attention to this one picture on your screen right now, which I think most kind of powerfully sums up the situation. This is these are 2 maps taken from 2 versions of the Devon Bird Atlas. One just before I was born in the 70s, and the recent update in 2013. And it shows just quite how catastrophically a familiar, beloved species like the cuckoo has been almost entirely lost across the county in all but those semi-natural habitats of Dartmoor and Exmoor, a species which is barely clinging on now and yet was ubiquitous and widespread 40, 50 years ago. Just one example, but I think a very visual one and a very visceral one, given it's a bird we all know and love, and I think many of you would have grown up experiencing being much, much more common than it is now. So this is why the work of Devon Wildlife Trust and other conservation organisations is frankly so critical. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell any further on that this evening. What I am going to go into now is a few examples of where the conservation sector here in Devon, as I said earlier, has been pioneers. We've pioneered solutions to these issues. And hopefully I'll leave you with a sense of hope that, and pride that us Devonians are really capable and really leading the way in bringing species back to this country. So I guess start with one last depressing slide, but it's an important one because this is a slide that really has fundamentally shaped my view on what's important in terms of UK conservation priorities. Where do we need to place our effort in terms of bringing species back in the UK? So the bar chart on the left is taken from the previous State of Nature report in 2015, and it's a chart which shows the drivers of biodiversity change in the UK. So what is making biodiversity more or less common? So the dark blue bars to the left demonstrate how powerfully certain factors are driving biodiversity loss, as you know, and the lighter blue, the turquoise bars to the right, are drivers which are driving biodiversity increases. And I won't go to it in detail, but the one thing that really jumps out at me on this, sadly and regrettably, and I say it with heavy heart as a proud farmer's son, is that the intensive management of agricultural land is overwhelmingly the biggest driver of biodiversity decline in the UK, overwhelmingly so. And that's manifested here clearly in this graph showing the decline of farmland birds. This is the farmland bird index from 1970 up until last year. And even though many of the steepest declines we can see occurred a long time ago in the 70s and 80s, the decline of farmland birds has continued, albeit at a slower rate, and is currently declining at 8%. So farmland biodiversity, our widespread common species of the countryside, are in serious trouble. And this has been driven fundamentally by the policies which dictate how our land is used. And as I say, that's a difficult truth for me to swallow as a proud farmer's son, to know that how land has been used on farms has, on balance, driven such biodiversity decline. But that has also given me a great fire and a great spirit to want to demonstrate how farming can be the solution to this problem. Indeed, in our countryside, which is predominantly farmed, farming is the only solution we have to this issue. So I'm going to move on to an example which I had very close contact with through the RSPB. But I should say first, as Vicky actually alluded to in her talk before the break, that Devon Wildlife Trust works county-wide with hundreds of farmers across tens of thousands of hectares to support them on improving the natural environment on their farms. And that's something I'm incredibly proud of. Indeed, that's one of the things that drew me to work for Devon Wildlife Trust, is how much investment and how much of our effort is put into supporting farmers to improve the natural environment on their farms. And we do groundbreaking work right the way across the county. But I'm not going to, on this example, talk about Devon Wildlife Trust work with farms. I'm going to talk about this example of pioneering conservation, which is the story of the cell bunting. And this is one of my favourite stories because it just gives such incredible hope in the face of those previous graphs, and shows really what is possible when conservationists, farmers, scientists, and government agencies work together with a common cause. So a little about the cell bunting, this beautiful bird here at the top. It's a bird whose population has undergone significant changes over the last 200 years. It was first described by Montague near Kingsbridge in South Devon in 1800, and then was recorded to gradually colonize southern England right the way throughout the 19th century. The population peaked in late 1800s and was found across many counties in England and Wales, as far north as Cumbria even. So we had that peak up to about 1900, and then we recorded a steady decline of the species from the 1930s to the 1960s, where the population absolutely collapsed across most of its range. And that collapse culminated by 1989 to there being only 118 pairs of cell bunting within the country. And by the mid-90s, a few years after that, the population was restricted purely between the tame RNEX, absolutely hanging on there at the southern tip of Devon, with a stronghold near to where this picture is taken at Prawle Point at the very southern end of the county. So absolutely hanging on by a thread and basically facing almost certain extinction from the UK. So when we find ourselves in these situations as conservationists, they obviously can't be solved overnight. So we follow a number of steps to first diagnose the causes of a species decline, and then develop, test, and finally roll out solutions that meet those issues. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is normalize those solutions by embedding them in sustainable management, so that the day-to-day management of land, in this case, is normalized in such a way that that species can both continue to recover and be sustained. So going on to the diagnosis, what was going on? What happened? Why did cell buntings decline so rapidly? So it really came down to three things. So first off, a lack of winter food. So as spring cropping gradually left the farm landscape and fewer winter stubbles were available for birds to feed on over the winter, so winter food became a very big issue. Now, spring cropping is when farmers plant their crops in the spring rather than in the autumn. And one of the very beneficial consequences of doing so is that they leave these things called winter stubbles, as I mentioned earlier. Now, winter stubbles are full of weeds and seeds which birds can eat over the winter when they need that food the most. But changes in cropping regimes meant that spring cropping and overwintering stubbles therefore becoming rarer and rarer, so winter food was a big issue. And then we get onto summer food, and cell bunting chicks are particularly reliant on grasshoppers, a really important component of their diets. And grasshopper populations we'd seen had declined across the landscape particularly with the intensification of grassland management, including more use of fertilizers and the switch from hay to silage. So grasshoppers were becoming less abundant, and finally a shortage of nesting sites. These lovely big thick hedges that we see at places here, this is Labrador Bay just near Sheldon, had been lost and damaged at a very, very wide scale, as I'm sure many of you know, throughout the earlier part of last century. So this lack of winter food, this lack of summer food, and fewer and fewer hedges in which to nest meant that the species was in really sharp decline, and that really was kind of symptomatic of this widespread move away from mixed livestock and arable farms towards much more uniformity in our farm landscape, and that loss of mixed farming more generally has driven all sorts of negative declines of biodiversity in the countryside. So we went about developing solutions. How therefore, what do we do about this? So it was all about restoring those conditions that had been lost on those farms, the conditions I spoke about earlier. So scientists, conservationists, Natural England, the government agencies worked closely together for years to effectively develop incentives to reward farmers for being a soil's best friend, excuse the pun, for rewarding farmers for bringing back those conditions on their farms that soils need. So ultimately, the sector developed a special bespoke soil bunting option in what's called an agri-environment scheme. So these are schemes which reward farmers for doing certain things for the environment. And we developed a special bespoke soil bunting scheme in the early 90s. And we encouraged farmers to enter 10-year agreements where they were paid to put in place a management regime that soil buntings need. And they were given specialist and very close advice by advisors, particularly from the RSPB, and actually particularly from this individual, Kath, in the photo here. So this is Kath Jeffs, who single-handedly did much of the advice to farmers over that period. And I'm quite proud to say, actually, Kath now works for Devon Wildlife Trust on the Wildcat project, which I'll speak a tiny bit about at the end of my presentation. Anyway, implementing these agreements and getting farmers back into management for soil bunting saw absolutely spectacular results. So between 1992 and 1998, there was an 83% increase in soil buntings on land under this positive management, and that compares to only a 2% increase on areas outside those agreements. So we knew that those agreements we developed, that farmers were picking up and being rewarded to manage their soils, were working, because where we had those agreements in place, soil bunting populations were increasing. And the agreements had loads of good benefits for other birds and insects and plant species as well. So in South Devon, we'd cracked the formula. We had farmers on board managing the land for farms. And what I love about this is it was farmers. It wasn't nature reserves, not really conservationists bringing this bird back. It was farmers in their farm landscape, through the normal course of their business, on commercial farms, going about their business, recovering a species that had been lost. But despite really good population expansion in Devon, there are slow species to expand their range. They don't move very far, even if the populations do increase locally. So it led us to ultimately conclude that we needed to bolster the UK population by reintroducing elsewhere to build more populations of soil buntings away from the South Devon landscapes. We looked at various locations, various places were shortlisted. Ultimately, the Isle of Wight was up there, Purbeck in Dorset, the Mendips in Somerset, but ultimately the Roseland Peninsula, pictured here in Cornwall, one of my favourite spots of Cornwall, was chosen as a place to which that was best suited to translocate soil buntings to, because already very good sympathetic farming systems were in place. Soil buntings had been there until quite recently. And as some of you may know, there's a very strong national trust presence in the Roseland Peninsula as well, so a very sympathetic landowner at the heart of the landscape as well. So then we had to work out, how do we get these birds into this new landscape? And we developed a partnership with Paignton Zoo and ZSL, and trialed various hand rearing and husbandry techniques to work out how we were going to get these species back. We looked at bringing the birds from Europe, but we were concerned the populations on the continent were a bit too fragile as well and in decline. We looked at bringing birds from New Zealand, where they've become established as an alien invasive species, but the New Zealand population is probably genetically too narrow, and there's all sorts of risks with transporting passerines all the way across the world. Sorry. Ultimately, we worked out the best thing to do, in spite of the risks entailed, were to take chicks from the South Devon population, rear those chicks in captivity, and then release them in Cornwall. As I say, that's not without that its risk, because we were taking chicks from a population that is only newly established and only just thriving. But we were confident that was possible. We knew that stood the best chance of successful kind of survival rates. And seals are a species that have 2 or 3 broods. So even if a few chicks were taken from the first brood, we knew that seal buntings would have subsequent broods of chicks. So between 2006 and 2011, there was a captive rear and release program of 376 birds from Devon to the Roseland. And where this is particularly pioneering is it's so far the only successful passerine songbird reintroduction in Europe. Small birds like this are, as I say, are incredibly difficult to hand rear and reintroduce. So the fact is, this is the only successful one we've managed so far. And after 25 years of working with seal buntings, a national survey was conducted in 2016, and that recorded the population as being above 1,000 pairs. So remember, we had less than 100 pairs in the early 90s, over 1,000 then by 2016, with a sustainable population established by then on the Roseland, over 65 territories on the Roseland. We've not done a full national survey since 2016, but there are lots of smaller surveys going on. And anecdotally, we know the population has grown and expanded considerably since then. And just thinking about the Roseland, somewhere that I visit quite often myself, I have this favorite run that I do around most of the Roseland Peninsula. And it's hard to do that run now in May without hearing seal buntings all the way around. Literally the whole coastline of the Roseland Peninsula has singing seal buntings as you go around. It's absolutely spectacular. So as I say, a real triumph of a story in terms of it being a great partnership between farming, conservation, science, and government agencies, and a real kind of success of using targeted agri-environment schemes with expert advice to support farmers to do brilliant things in their farm businesses. And just briefly, the innovations with regards to seal buntings don't end there. So in the heart of the seal buntings range, as you get closer to Exeter, Teignbridge, and East Devon, there is considerable housing pressure, as many of you will know, and seal buntings breed in places which aren't necessarily protected. They don't breed on nature reserves, on triple SIs, on protected land, so they are at risk from housing development. But through developing an excellent, in effect, biodiversity net gain scheme before biodiversity net gain actually became a nationally adopted scheme. We do have these schemes with authorities like Teignbridge District Council, whereby if seal bunting habitat is due to be threatened by housing development, credits are banked by, in this case, TDC, and those credits then pay for basically mitigation and seal bunting habitat creation elsewhere. So these 2 stars here are 2 RSPB land holdings, Labrador Bay near Sheldon on the right of the Teign, and Ash Hill on the left of your picture in between Bishop's Tainton and Teignmouth. And these are 2 sites that were effectively purchased for seal buntings, managed for seal buntings, through the proceeds of those credits and those levies raised on housing development in Teignbridge District Council. So a really innovative scheme that was well before its time when it came about a few years ago. So moving us on, if we think of farmland biodiversity decline as the most serious conservation issue in the UK, I think of the marine environment as the jewel in the crown of conservation in the UK. So on the global scale, on the global stage, the UK absolutely punches well above its weight in terms of the marine environment. The UK holds 95% of Europe's grey seals, a quarter of Europe's seabirds, 68% of the world's gannets, and a whopping 90% of the world's Manx shearwaters. 90% of the world's Manx shearwaters nest in the UK. And of those, 95% of England's Manx shearwaters nest in Devon, here on Lundy, the Isle of Lundy. Now, in 1939, there were more than 3,500 pairs of puffins on the Isle of Lundy, but by the year 2000, only 13 pairs of puffins. There had been no Manx shearwater chicks found on Lundy since 1959. No chicks at all since the late 50s. Compare that to nearby Scotcombe Islands in Pembrokeshire, where there are 350,000 pairs of Manx shearwaters. So something was awry on Lundy. The reason, quite simply, the introduced non-native brown and black rats. These are a species which predate burrow nesting seabird species, and basically anywhere you have rats and burrow nesting species, you will have zero breeding success. And this is an issue we see right the way across the world, from New Zealand to the UK overseas territories like Gough and Henderson Island and the such like. But thanks to places like New Zealand, which have got, for sad reasons, a real expertise in removing non-native predators, often from Europe in that case, we've been able to export that expertise about how do we restore island ecosystems to remove non-native predators to allow native species to thrive. So, so New Zealand expertise has been coming across to the UK for several decades now, beginning really with some successful eradications of the Pembrokeshire Islands in the early 2000s. So, having seen the Pembrokeshire Islands, like Ramsey, restored successfully in the early 2000s, the sector hatched a plan to do the same on Lundy. So between 2003 and 2006, the non-native rats on Lundy were entirely eradicated. It was a partnership between the RSPB, the Natural England National Trust, and the Landmark Trust. And I'm not going to go into the hows and wherefores of how that project worked, but suffice to say, it's difficult to underestimate quite how difficult these island restoration, these eradication projects are. Difficult logistically, difficult technically, difficult in terms of aligning the funding and the support, and often very controversial too, for reasons that I sympathise with. So this project at Lundy in particular was vehemently opposed by some animal rights groups who, for understandable reasons, did not agree with the ethics of removing rats from the island. So often, these projects are incredibly difficult with very difficult ethical balancing questions. And in this case, it got really quite difficult, death threats and all. But nonetheless, the project proceeded, it was successful, and the graphs I'm about to show you, following this season's surveys that just concluded last summer, are about as incredible as any graph you'll ever see in natural science. So here we go. Having surveyed Lundy since eradication, the results, they are absolutely astounding. There are few interventions in conservation where you can witness such immediate and direct results from doing something to seeing the results on the ground. So the full seabird assemblage here on the left, the population of seabirds on Lundy now exceeds 40,000 birds. And that's a third time the population has been calculated to exceed 20,000 birds. And 20,000 is an important figure because 20,000 is the qualifying figure for special protection area status, which is European level protection. And that figure of 40,000 birds is the highest number we've seen since the 1930s. There are 25,000 Manx shearwater or 12,500 occupied burrows, if you want to look at it that way. And that's an increase on 500 pre-eradication. So 500 to 25,000. Storm petrel are back. They bred for the first time in 2014, and we've now got 322 individuals compared to only 11 in 2018. And remember puffins? I spoke about there only being 13 puffins in the year 2000. There are now over 1,300 puffins breeding on Lundy. It's now the third largest cliff nesting colony in England after Flamborough Head and the Northumberland coast. And as I say, well exceeds that threshold for special protection area status. So a massive, massive success we witnessed on Lundy. And I must just say, if anyone hasn't been to Lundy and you have the opportunity, please do go. It is one of the most magical experiences you will ever experience, particularly if you get to spend the night there and you hear the Manx shearwaters coming in at midnight. It truly is one of the most unforgettable experiences you will ever have. And the seas around Lundy, moving on from the seabirds on the land, the seas around Lundy gave way to some UK firsts as well. So Lundy was the first of the UK's marine protected areas. It was established as a marine nature reserve in 1986, and it incorporated a no-take zone, albeit a small one, on the eastern side of the island in 2003, and it was designated a marine conservation zone in 2010. That no-take zone made it the first legally enforced no fishing area in the UK, full stop. And having monitored the impact of that no fishing area from 2003 to 2007, we witnessed a massive increase in commonly fished species such as lobster inside the no-take zone. And also, worth noting actually that a massive increase in species like lobster outside of the no-take zone as well. So where lobster could be fished, we saw benefits to the fishing community as a consequence of the no-take zone. So the no-take zone doesn't just benefit areas where fishing doesn't happen, it benefits the areas around it as well. Moving on to the south coast, the other coast of Devon, and the marine area more generally, the reef habitats of Lyme Bay are home to a really rich and diverse marine life, and also valuable seafood species such as crab and scallop as well. Now, environment groups first started calling for protection of the seabird habitats at Lyme Bay after Devon Wildlife Trust carried out surveys in the early part of the 90s. We had divers out there in Lyme Bay surveying those reefs, just trying to understand quite how important they were. It was about this time, actually, early 90s, that my biology teacher at school, who was a really keen diver, and he dived in Lyme Bay, he persuaded me that we are a country that does indeed have corals and sea fans and reefs. I didn't believe it as a young child, but we absolutely do, and they're amazing, and they look like this. Anyway, those pioneering Devon Wildlife Trust surveys showed the marine life of Lyme Bay was indeed of national or perhaps international conservation importance. But what those surveys also showed us in the early 90s was that about 10% of the reefs had been altered or destroyed by dredging. This is what we mean by scallop dredging. So this is what you see above the surface. These are the vessels you see. I'm sure you've all seen them yourself. But what's happening underwater is just this. In order to bring up those scallops, the seabed is literally dredged en masse. And it has pretty profound impacts, as you can quite imagine. It can take seabeds looking like this on the left to this on the right. It absolutely removes potentially all habitat, most biodiversity from the seabed. So Devon Wildlife Trust led recommendations back in '93 to stop dredging, and not only on conservation grounds, because the conservation grounds were strong enough to stand on their own rights, but our recommendations were backed up by the economics as well, that showed that there was more value to be gained by stopping scallop dredging from Lyme Bay, but allowing potting, sea angling, and diving to continue to thrive. And indeed, those other industries could only thrive if scallop dredging closed. So that was in the early part of the 90s. It wasn't until the early part of the noughties in 2001 that voluntary measures were introduced. So voluntary measures to stop dredging, and that had some impact for a short time, but sadly, as is inevitably the case with voluntary measures, it became ineffective in time. So we were very pleased after continued campaigning, and we're talking about kind of 2 decades later now, a real story of tenacity here. 60 square nautical miles of the bay were closed to bottom trawling by statutory instruments. For reefs, the rare corals, the sea fans now protected and allowed to recover over 60 square nautical miles. And that area was then increased to 90 square nautical miles in 2010. And in doing so, that de facto made it the largest marine protected area in the UK at the time, all as a consequence of the advocacy work and the surveys that Devon Wildlife Trust began 2 decades earlier. And soon after that, Lyme Bay and Tall Bay was designated a special area of conservation, a European level designation in 2011. And within just 4 years of stopping bottom trawling, the overall abundance and diversity more than doubled. We saw 7 times more pink sea fans. We saw 4.5 times more juvenile lobsters. It was hailed as a great success, not just by conservationists, but by fishers as well, seen as a genuine win-win model where the fishing industry and biodiversity could thrive together, and they both benefited from this intervention. So, as I say, a great example of that tenacity and innovation from Devon Wildlife Trust through decades of excellent campaigning work. And I'm just then going to finish on a story which really is at the heart of Devon Wildlife Trust pioneering spirit. And this is one that you've no doubt come across before if you're a DWT member, and has been alluded to already this evening. And that's a story of how a project which began working with an enclosed population of beavers in the west of the county led us ultimately to the first legal release of beavers into the wild in Devon, creating what we now know is the thriving wild population we're so proud of in the River Otter. But before I talk a bit more about how that happens, I think it's just worth recapping on why we get so excited about beavers. They're an amazing, charismatic native species that belongs here, and it's great to have them here. But it's more than just that with beavers. They're a keystone species which has profound impacts on the landscape. They engineer the landscapes in which they live in very beneficial ways. And I'm just going to run you through a series of diagrams and then a flyover to show the impact they can have on a small watercourse just here. So this is at the beginning of a series in 2011 where the watercourse was barely discernible, just a small pond in the middle. And then you can see over the series of 6 years or so, through the creation of dams and the various other interventions that beavers bring to the landscape, a really, really profound change to the landscape, creating this amazing wetland out of nothing, effectively. And what that wetland looked like was this. Apologies if this is a bit jerky on your screens, but just a flyover of what this looked like from the sky. Absolutely amazing. Now, and those are habitats that man just could not create ourselves. That is natural natural landscape engineering at its very, very best. And they have all sorts of other benefits. So what this graph is showing here is the impact of this beaver habitat and the beaver dams on water flow. So we can see at periods of very high rainfall coming into the beaver dams, that has evened out considerably when it comes out the other end. So it's taking out the peak flows during these flood events. And conversely, it's also holding water in periods of low rainfall and drought. It's significantly reducing the amplitude of lower water events. So effectively, these habitats are acting like sponges and holding water back when it's dry and absorbing water when it's very, very wet. They can have really amazing impacts in terms of reducing suspended sediment. So here's two pictures here of what the water looks like above and below the beaver dams. And it's not shown here, but they can also reduce nutrient loads, things like nitrates and phosphates, considerably at the bottom of their dams. So loads of benefits that beavers bring beyond just being a wonderful native mammal. And these are benefits that, as I say, would be incredibly costly, complicated, carbon intensive, very bureaucratic to deliver by man-made engineering means. So how did we get here? So the River Otter, as many of you will know, is quite an intensively managed river catchment. It's dominated by improved grassland, dairy farming, with some arable and horticulture. So a very intensively managed catchment. But beavers have been present on the river since about 2007, 2008. We don't quite know how they got there, but they were there nonetheless. Anyway, it was only when video footage emerged in 2014 showing beaver kits, showing that beavers had bred, that the government started to get involved and said, maybe we shouldn't have beavers here. So upon this footage of beaver kits emerging, the government's initial reaction was to propose removing beavers from the river. Devon Wildlife Trust obviously opposed that vehemently, as did the local community, who were up in arms about this concept of removing beavers. So after consulting with the local community, landowners, public bodies, etc., DWT presented this alternative plan to try and turn the situation into a 5-year trial to monitor the effect of beavers on the landscape. And thus was born the River Otter Beaver Trial in 2015. And in doing so, allowing beavers back into the landscape in 2015, it was the first legal release of beavers into the wild in England under license from Devon Wildlife Trust. In effect, the first ever reintroduction of an extinct mammal into England. Absolutely groundbreaking. So the population has thrived and gradually expanded across the river catchment, as you can see here. But as a landscape engineers, beavers have impacts, and sometimes those impacts need managing. And this is where the Devon Wildlife Trust really played an incredibly important role. To be frank and rather flippant about it, kind of anyone can reintroduce a species into the wild, kind of in a rogue, illegal sense. Anyone can chuck one out there, but to do it successfully, for that species to survive, and crucially to do so with the support of communities, that requires immense professionalism and a really careful strategy. So Devon Wildlife Trust took ownership of this strategy to manage the impacts of beavers. They clearly have profound impacts on trees, tree coppicing. We intervened and helped trial things like sandy paint mixes, which we put on sensitive trees to make sure that beavers might not remove those trees, or fencing and tree guards on economically or important trees, such as in orchards, to preempt their protection. We've helped secure funding for landowners, rewarding landowners for the services that beavers are providing where they have beavers on their land. We help remove the heights of dams in sensitive locations where necessary. And in more extreme circumstances, we install these things, beaver deceivers, these bypass channels that allow beavers to continue doing their thing, but water bypasses the beaver dams. So at the heart of this approach was really helping us recognize that if beavers were permitted to remain, we need to once again learn how to live alongside them and to pragmatically and efficiently mitigate those conflicts. And that's the role DWT played. Anyway, long story short, a 5-year trial concluded, and in 2000 it was deemed a success by the government. And in deeming it a success, that allowed beavers to remain on the River Otter permanently and continue to expand their range naturally. That decision by government, allowing beavers to remain in 2000, was arguably the most groundbreaking decision our government's made on wildlife in a generation. Absolutely amazing. And we know through that trial project that overwhelmingly, the majority of society wants to see this species back on our waterways. So what next for beavers? So there are 3 things we're very clearly calling out for now that beavers are established and legally living wild on the River Otter. So we need an ambitious strategy for wild releases right away across England. We need to secure the future for all wild populations. There are other unsanctioned wild populations of beaver living right the way across England, and many here in Devon. We need to ensure they're officially sanctioned, and we need to ensure our populations are genetically resilient as well, potentially being able to translocate species between populations. And as we've been doing so far on the otter, we need to ensure there's financial support in place for landowners who make space for beaver landscapes. So that's what we're calling for next with beavers. And I'm not going to dwell on it here, but as you've heard from Vicky already, it doesn't stop there with beavers. Devon Wildlife Trust is now looking very seriously at the possibility of reintroducing pine martens into the southwest, and we've just today submitted a very significant funding bid to the lottery to do just that. And we're at the early stages of investigating the feasibility of whether a reintroduction of wildcats into the southwest might be possible as well. So it doesn't stop there. I'm just going to finish, and sorry I've gone on for a bit longer than I intended to, just going to finish on a slightly different note, which I hope is a note of hope. So you've seen some of the great pioneering, brilliant things that we've done in Devon for wildlife, and I hope that gives you a sense of hope and optimism for the future. But there's another thing I think I would leave you with, and that we obviously live in difficult times. There's some challenging things happening in the economy and in global affairs across the world, and people have a lot of worries and a lot of things to consider in their lives at the moment. But do have a look at this online if you ever get the chance. There's a weekly tracker which YouGov run, asking people what are the top 3 most important issues facing you in the country. And consistently, the environment is incredibly high up there, running at about 31% right now. So in spite of everything else that's going on in the world, in spite of all the challenges people face, the environment is incredibly important. And as you can see, tracking back to about 2017, it's been on a steady increase in terms of its relative importance to people compared to other issues. So I remain very optimistic about what we're capable of as a sector, and I'm very optimistic in terms of how much I think people at large care about the environment, and nowhere is that more manifestly shown than through the support we get from people like yourselves. So thank you so very much for listening. Sorry I've gone on a bit longer than planned. I'll look to take a few questions now in the last 5-10 minutes or so. But thanks for your support, and thanks very much for listening. I'll just end the slideshow now.